Welcome to the Constructive 2020 virtual event series. Constructive is an industry-led effort to enhance collaboration, build resilience, and ensure a vibrant and sustainable future for the industry. Welcome to our third virtual event, Opportunities for Reinvention and Transformation, the political agenda for the sector's future. This session is brought to you by Registered Master Builders and BusinessNZ. Welcome to Constructive 2020. Let's go live to the PwC Centre in Wellington.
Kia ora, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to Constructive 2020. It's great to have you with us for our third webinar in this series. A very special afternoon today. We have an election coming up in just over a month, and today we have the chance to hear from some of our senior politicians to outline their vision for the building and construction sector. Now, we know, of course, that the sector has huge value to New Zealand. It employs around 500,000 people, either directly or indirectly. So what do our political parties have to say about the challenging months ahead? What is their vision and what do they see as the opportunities for building and construction and the people that work within it? We're going to be joined today by the Finance Minister, the Honourable Grant Robertson. We'll also be hearing from National's finance spokesperson, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith. Joining me here in Wellington is a panel to dissect what they've been hearing and also to put some questions to our ministers. We have Kirk Hope. Kirk is the Chief Executive of BusinessNZ, New Zealand's leading business advocacy group. We also have Daryl Trigg. Daryl is Managing Director of Trigg Construction. He's been delivering quality commercial builds for local businesses in Northland for over 25 years. Helen O'Sullivan is with us. She is Chief Executive of Crocker's Property Group, an Auckland-based provider of property services. We also have Johnny Corley. Now, Johnny founded Corley Homes in 2008, which specialises in designing and building architecturally designed homes. So welcome to all of our panellists. We look forward to your input during the afternoon and would love some input from you as well at home or work or wherever you might be. Send us your questions for the Minister and the Opposition's finance spokesperson. You can send those questions through the app, through the chat function on the web page that you're watching this video right now. Those questions will go to our moderators and they'll come through to me as well. We will feed those into the discussion, and at the end of this session, we'll hear from our panellists to see what their verdict is on what we've heard from our politicians. So let's get underway today here in Wellington, and we'll begin with the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson. Now, Grant is also the Minister for Sport and Recreation and the Associate Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage. He's been the Member of Parliament for Wellington Central since 2008, and he's here to share his thoughts. Welcome, Grant.
Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you, Jahan, and thanks to the panel and Master Builders and all the organisers of today's event for the opportunity to be with you. What I want to do today is sketch out what we have been doing in terms of the construction sector and what we'd like to do in partnership. The first thing I would like to say at the outset is a recognition of the impact of COVID-19 on the sector. Clearly, like all sectors of the economy, as we moved into level 4 and level 3, this was a hugely challenging environment. We've worked well with the sector over a long period of time, and I'll return back to talking about the construction sector accord shortly, but I want to make particular reference to the work that we were able to do during level 4 in particular to prepare ourselves for level 3 and to see the sector back up and running during that time and then through into level 2. 1 and now back into level 2. The sector has worked hard to put itself in a position to be able to be active and continue to contribute to the economy, and I thank all of you for your role in that. As Jahan has already referenced, the size of the building and construction sector, both in terms of employment and its contribution to GDP, is significant. Directly, the sector is the 4th largest employer and contributed over 6% of GDP at the end of 2019. So it's a sector we take seriously. It's the reason why we've moved so actively to be involved in it. It's also why, when we look towards what will help us to recover and rebuild from COVID-19 in terms of stimulus in particular, I've seen studies that say that for every dollar invested in construction, there's somewhere between $2.21 and $3.11 of economic activity. So it's a multiplier sector and therefore one that deserves close attention as we look to recover and rebuild from from COVID-19. But as I said, we're very well aware that during the difficulty of COVID-19, we saw a retraction. Similarly, when we looked at the numbers for the period around the global financial crisis, we attempted to take some lessons from that. If we look at the period between 2008 and 2011, there was a drop of between 25 and 30% of employment in the sector, and house building activity fell by approximately 50% during that period. And I've seen again research that tells us that it took many years for the sector to recover from that. We do not want to repeat that mistake. And one of the reasons why we've invested significantly during this period of time, for example, in supporting businesses to keep their apprentices on, is to make sure that we don't fall into that trap again of not having the workforce that we need as the economy recovers and as we move towards a post-COVID era. So it's very important for us that we achieve a number of goals in this period. The first of those is the one around workforce, and I'll return to that in a moment. The second of those is around the perennial question of pipeline and making sure that we do have some clarity on the pipeline of work that is available. We've done a lot of work while we've been in government to help establish that. Firstly, the establishment of the Infrastructure Commission, something that the sector has been asking for years, to be able to have a greater level of certainty about what's coming through. That work was helpful to us as we moved into the COVID period, but it needs to continue and to develop. We need a much greater partnership between central and local government, between all of us in the private sector and iwi, in terms of identifying that pipeline and making sure it's clear for everybody to be involved in. The other area there that as we look ahead is around the role the government plays in procurement. And the rules that we set for government procurement will be very important to our ability to be able to help lead recovery and rebuild within the sector. And we've already undertaken some work in that area, but I'll mention towards the end of my comments some others that we'd like to do. But if we just want to reflect for a couple of minutes on how we've supported the sector through COVID-19, I think it is useful and again highlights the significance of the sector. With the wage subsidy and wage subsidy extension, 203,000 unique jobs in the sector have been supported, amounting to over nearly $1.5 billion worth of payments. And actually for the wage subsidy extension, another 56,000 construction jobs, $253 million in payments. For the small business cash flow loan scheme, construction businesses were have been among the greatest users of that scheme. Small builders who have taken on that loan in order to be able to manage their cash flow and manage their outgoings in a period where their work's been variable. Those contributions we think have been really important to giving some confidence and certainty to the sector to be able to get through COVID-19. Alongside that, we've also established the Residential Development Response Fund. That's a $350 million fund to help progress the developments that are either stalled or at risk, and we're looking for this to be similar to the way we've used KiwiBuild guarantees, but the fund being open to all housing, not just KiwiBuild qualified housing. So those emergency and immediate response measures have been an important part for us of supporting the sector. Alongside that, we've made a number of announcements that have given, I hope, some level of confidence and an indication of the direction of travel that we're looking to move in. The first of those is the announcement of the building of 8,000 new public and transitional housing places over the next 4 to 5 years. This has been funded by a $5 billion increase in Kaingora's borrowing program and $570 million in operating funding to support that. We've announced our progressive home ownership scheme, $400 million allocated towards supporting the scheme, with the emphasis being on new builds and making sure that they are taken up under the scheme. The $3 billion in the infrastructure fund that we established under the COVID Response and Recovery Fund includes a number of direct housing projects, but also is built around building and construction projects out over the next year. And then the trade and apprenticeship training package, which brings me to one of, as I said, the major major long-term issues that are important in the sector. This is a $1.6 billion sector. It includes package. It includes $320 million targeted towards free trades training in critical industries, of which building and construction is one of those. It includes $412 million in support, as I said, for employers to retain and keep existing apprenticeships. We want to continue to build our partnership in this sector, and I was pleased to be able to attend the opening of the first Centre of Vocational Excellence at the Manukau Institute of Technology last week, which is dedicated to the construction industry. Again, this is a partnership being developed with the partners in the Accord to make sure that we get the highest possible quality of training going through our institutions. Too often in the past, when I've been speaking with people in the construction industry, they have expressed their concern about whether or not the people coming out of our institutions, particularly our polytechs, are the people that they want to employ. It's time we did better than that. That will happen as a result of having things like a Centre of Vocational Excellence that brings industry players right into the picture of the kinds of programs that we're developing. So alongside that injection of funds to support more apprentices through the targeted free training, we also want to make sure we're lifting the quality of that. The other significant element of what we've done is what we've done from a regulatory and legislative point of view. So the COVID-19 Recovery Fast Track Consenting Act went through Parliament. This was designed to ensure that we could accelerate eligible infrastructure and development projects, and in turn, again, support certainty and employment in the sector. And we're working through that now to expedite those consenting and designation processes. One that's very popular with the DIYers and slightly less popular with some of the builders has been the exemptions from building consents for a number of low-risk building activities such as sleep-out sheds and carports. A number of smaller builders have certainly been involved in that, and we think that's a really important way of making sure that we can get those small projects done without the red tape in the way. We believe it's going to save homeowners around $18 million in consenting costs each year, and that's really important. The work still has to meet the building code to assure all of those in the building industry, but I do think that will see a number of smaller projects flourish there. Alongside that, as I say, are a number of other regulatory and legislative programs that are important and are ongoing. The Building System Legislative Reform Program, which is the first comprehensive package of reforms that Minister Salisa has led since 2004. These changes are designed to strengthen the performance of the building sector through the regulation of products and occupations, changing the way that risk and liability is allocated, and strengthening penalties for those who don't comply. We are doing further work on the building code delivery framework to make sure that we strengthen the management and delivery of that and improve overall understanding of it. That includes minimum performance standards being modernised and clearly articulated so that we do get flexibility in design, construction methods and products, and the sector is well represented in providing us advice on that. We've had the review of the Resource Management Act, which will be a significant part of the next government's agenda as we establish more appropriate legislation to support sustainable development and good quality planning. However, we haven't been resting on our laurels when it comes to the RMA. We've also produced the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, which is going to facilitate quality urban development right around New Zealand. And while we've been doing that work, we've also been working with spatial plans and master plans for a number of regions, particularly Queenstown and now Tauranga, where the government is actually an active partner in that spatial planning exercise. We want to continue to develop that both here in Wellington and Auckland and also in Christchurch. Alongside that, we've passed legislation on the Infrastructure Funding and Financing Act, which will enable more flexible forms of financing to support development. This is particularly through the creation of special purpose vehicles that will enable both local and central government to take the costs of development off their balance sheet and partner with the private sector in the development of that. And that legislation was passed just before the government before Parliament rose. All of this is backed backed up by significant financial investment by the government. A total of $57.8 billion in capital is forecast to be available between the financial year that we've just finished and 2023-24. On average, that represents around $10 billion a year going into capital spending across the board. That compares with the previous decade or so with an average of around $4 billion a year. So that is a genuine commitment from the government to invest in capital, and including in areas that will significantly support the work of the building and construction industry. As we look ahead, I want to focus around implementing all of those many initiatives, because there's a lot of balls in the air, and we appreciate that the sector needs to come with us as we put them into place. But part of that is the further development of the construction sector accord. It is our view that this has been a successful initiative. It's certainly given us a great deal more insight into how the construction sector works. As most of you will know, phase one of it was around retaining a viable sector through lockdown. This is the response plan developed by the Accord, then ensuring readiness to restart works, and then working on transformation. And that's a refocus on that high performance construction sector that I mentioned before. We are committed to that, and we are committed to supporting the sector as it develops its work going ahead. I mentioned before the question of procurement, and I do think this is an area where we can do a great deal more work. Not only does the government procure a lot of goods and services itself, so does local government. And we do need new procurement rules that will actually support a strong sector. As we've discussed with the Construction Sector Accord, moving away from a lowest price model to a broader outcome model is essential for the sector to be sustainable. That means taking into account the overall health of the sector and the contribution that the sector makes to the overall sustainable development of New Zealand. Moving to that procurement model, we believe, will provide significant more opportunities for New Zealand businesses to be involved. In addition to that, we want to work on the new streamlined consenting process for prefabricated buildings, which we think provide an excellent example of how we can move forward in a much quicker way within the sector. And then the overall transformation plan, which, as I say, includes the new workforce plan, strengthening the industry's voice and training, driving cooperation through information sharing and education programs, and promoting simpler, shorter contracts that don't overburden subcontractors as they do their work. This is a busy sector, and it's one where we've had a busy program, and we will continue to work in that way in partnership with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Grant, for your insights and comments there. We'd love for you to join us on the panel, and we'll be able to take some questions from our four panellists and also from you at home or work. Please submit your questions via the question function, and we will be able to feed them into this discussion. So let's get underway here, and I'll begin with you, Kirk. What were your thoughts on what you just heard from the Minister, and what would you like to ask him?
Thanks, Jihan. I think there's clearly a very comprehensive work program underway, Minister. My question is really, the sector is critical. One is a critical one for the economy in terms of jobs, some 500,000 jobs. Your government has committed a lot of money to apprenticeships, and apprenticeships obviously rely on those jobs. A lot of announcements and a lot of dollars attached to the announcements that you've just talked about. The challenge, I think, if you're returned as Minister of Finance, would be how would you ensure that the building and construction sector maintains a priority role in Cabinet and those things are able to be delivered? What role can you play in that?
Yeah, I hope, Kirk, from what you heard me say today, that as the Minister of Finance, these are matters that are within a number of different ministers' portfolios, building and construction, environment, housing and so on. But I hope you've seen from what I've delivered today that I keep an oversight of them as the Finance Minister, as the government's kind of lead on the broader economy, because I recognise the significance of it. And I think we can be judged by our deeds here. We moved quickly with the establishment of the Construction Sector Accord because we could see the issues that were there in the industry, and we recognised straight away that it had to be a partnership if it was going to be meaningful. And while it can't be perfect and it can't deliver anything, having that accord with senior ministers involved, myself and the Prime Minister with an oversight of it, I think should give the sector confidence that we take these issues seriously. I think we could all see the path we were going down with the collapse of the major building contractors and what that was looking like. We've stopped that. We've got a lot more clarity, but it doesn't mean that there aren't still going to be issues. But yeah, I take it seriously, and so does the Prime Minister. Thanks.
There are 5 separate ministers, though, aren't there, for the sector? I'd be interested to know what has your experience been over the last 3 years around the cabinet table, because that's one of the things that often comes up in the sector, is that people feel that there is still a disconnect between some of those ministers on various issues. What has your experience been?
Yeah, look, I think the nature of government is that, unless we had one big Uber department, and, Stephen Joyce started to try to do that and then ended up being interrupted before he could create a single department to rule them all. But, in all seriousness, what we've got to do is be able to get those ministers working off the same plan. I don't think it matters that there are 4 or 5 as long as they're working to the same plan and we have regular accountability. That's exactly what the construction sector accord does. So
can you guarantee that?
Yeah, those ministers meet on a very regular basis to assess where they're going. Can I guarantee perfection on that? Of course I can't. And the nature of human beings and organisations is that you will from time to time have some elements where there might be confusion or there might be contradiction. The thing now is we've got a vehicle to deal with that.
Helen, what would you like to ask the Minister?
So, Minister, I'm delighted to see the recognition of the need to keep the sector moving. Repeating the post-GFC mistakes would be catastrophic for all of us. I suppose there's a small window to really keep. There's a 3 to 6 month window, and to get in that time, government's going to need to be agile and cross-sector coordinator, which are 2 things it's not historically been famous for. And it's going to have to really collaborate with the private sector. And historically, there's been a real mutual misunderstanding and distrust between those 2 sectors. How are you going to break that down to kind of really, this is such an urgent thing and NZ Inc. is really dependent on it. Yeah. What are your tools for breaking that down?
Again, I think our deeds are where I'd go to. So, one of the real things that became really clear in COVID-19, in the heart of it, was that actually we could move swiftly, we could be agile, and what we've really encouraged the public service is to capture that spirit. And if I give us an example that's related to the sector but not part of the sector, we were able in Auckland and Wellington anyway to largely end rough sleeping in those 2 cities during the period of time of COVID. And that happened because public servants were enabled to do that. They were just told this is what has to happen. They worked with the NGOs and the providers of accommodation and they did it. And that spirit of saying, actually, you are empowered to do this. This is what we need done. And, we have the information now. The fact is that while the infrastructure reference groups had some interesting publicity, we now know the 1,900 projects that are out there ready to go. We weren't able to fund all of them. We're only able to fund a fraction of them. But ongoing discussions are now taking place with a number of councils, iwi, private sector organisations about the pipeline of work that's there and what kind of partnerships we can develop. So I think we've done it, and that it's really now a matter of taking it to the next level and the next step as we move past the crisis stage.
So are you keeping that all of government kind of committee framework that was...
Yeah, so the all-government group's continuing, right. And obviously in a somewhat reduced form from what it looked like, and we're continuing...
Same big stick.
We're continuing to look at ways of how we get the channels of communication, particularly between the government and the private sector, flowing as well as it can. Now, Kirk and I were talking every week, sometimes twice a week, sometimes every day during the core of that period, and I think we've just got to keep doing that, but also doing that on a sector-by-sector basis.
It does beg the question, though. I mean, why has it taken a global pandemic for us to break down some of those silos? I mean, it's great that that's starting to happen. When you came into the portfolio, what were some of the things that you noticed in terms of those structural roadblocks that you found actually in the way that the system
I feel like I should have the opportunity to lie on a couch for this bit of the discussion, because it was very difficult. I've said this before. In fact, I've said this before in a very similar forum to this one. One of the most extraordinary things for me was the lack of information that central government had about what local government was doing, in terms of what projects were coming through, what were the barriers, where they were. There was virtually no interaction there. We moved swiftly on that, and part of the Infrastructure Commission's job was to get out from local government where that is. So the nature of government is the silo-based nature of it. We've made some changes that won't, most people in the sector won't have followed, that will actually help that. We've passed a piece of legislation called the Public Service Act, which is actually designed to bring agencies together more often. Our Public Finance Act and State Sector Act have been set up to create the silos, to stop agencies sharing money. We've been breaking that down. The previous government did a little bit of it as well, and we've built on that. That's where the wellbeing budget comes from, is actually saying what are the outcomes we want. We've had such a focus in government on inputs for so long. We'd started to move to outputs, i.e. kind of dollars and cents and numbers, but the actual outcomes, a high quality housing stock that's affordable and accessible. If you set that goal, you can then set the ministers off on that and bring them back to that goal. So that whole way of budgeting that I was championing through the wellbeing approach is actually designed to break the silos down. But just to answer your question properly, Jahan, that is not a 3-year job.
Are you confident that that momentum, so in terms of the building and construction sector, the ability to move at speed, are you confident that that momentum will be maintained after COVID? And do you believe that the public service is willing to continue working in the way that it's currently having to work, in a more pragmatic, practical, faster, more responsive way? Or will we go back to the way that we've been doing things?
I just think we have to carry on. It's not a matter of, it's not, to me, it's not a question of can we? It's actually that we have to. And as I say, I think the public servants themselves have felt empowered within that. I mean, clearly it's still a legislative process or a regulatory process, and there are rules about that, and we do have to consult. We can't just barrel on, but what we can do is have much more clarity about the outcomes and much more confidence that the public servants are empowered to implement them.
I think some of the most successful projects within the sector have been, it's well known, been through collaboration. And I think it's helpful to understand it probably been a kick from COVID, but going forward that there'd be more collaboration within government and with local government as well, because it makes a massive difference.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess one of the things for us too, it does, and I absolutely agree with that. I think one of the things for us is that we need, for example, the contracting process, the procurement process needs to be simplified down. And one of the issues is it's still a competitive market. You're still going to be tendering into that with others. And so therefore it has to be fair and it has to be transparent. So getting those two attributes alongside rapid delivery, that's the trick. And that's where some of the changes to the RMA will be significant to be able to support that, and helping local government with their capability to be able to deliver as well. And partnerships are the key to that.
Johnny, you're seeing what this looks like on the ground, what the minister's talked about. What are your thoughts on what he said?
Oh, look, I think it's important that we recognise building and construction as an obvious choice to help rebuild the economy as we come out of it. It's available and through the alert levels to carry on. And I think the targeted spending policy will be extremely important. And I think you've done a good job of that, or a good start so far, focusing on the apprentices and trade training, because the lessons from the GFC was that we had no one to rebuild the economy, because we lost all those people to other parts of the economy. So aside from, so we've got to concentrate on that, but we also need to focus on how do we stimulate the pipeline. Now, if we look at the broader numbers around the GDP, 60% of that's residential construction. 80% of the apprentices sit inside residential construction, and 95% of them are SMEs. So we actually need direct stimulus into the smaller scale residential construction. So I'd be quite interested to understand what type of stimulus policies you'll look to encourage that side of the market. Yeah,
and look, we recognise that, and there were some projects within the infrastructure reference group that went there. There's a good one up in Taupo that's been done, and there's a couple of others that we want to do. We've still got the Kiwi Build program there, and it is still producing contracts, and it is still producing builds. the immediate stimulus program is that residential development response fund to make sure that anything that's in the pipeline gets pushed out the other end.
The question I have there, though, is how far does that penetrate to the SMEs?
Yeah.
You know, you're talking about larger scale development, and so, you know, we've got to look at, you know, the targeted spend is great,
Yeah.
but how far does that go? Where does that penetrate?
Well, you know, we hope it does. And one of the interesting things for me, being, you know, in the period of time we are now, and I'm travelling around the country, is I'm talking to a lot of those SMEs who are actually very, very busy right now. And the reason for that, obviously, is everyone spent a whole lot of time at home staring at the kitchen and the bathroom that they no longer like. And so that's going to sustain people, I think, through to the end of the year. As we move into next year, obviously, we've got our bit around the 8,000 public houses that we want to start building. But that is where the leverage of the Kiwi Build Fund needs to come in. It's where we need more of the prefab stuff being advanced as well, where we know that SMEs will be able to be part of that.
Can I just test you a little bit further on that? Because a lot of the infrastructure spend and same with Kaingaroa is public asset, you know, outcome. Private sector is totally, you know, has a different outcome. So I think we need to be braver and encourage spending through the private sector. And if we look at the first home grant, for instance, it's not really fit for purpose. So and the thresholds that are set and are in place won't allow the private sector to continue to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that that's your feedback. I mean, obviously those have been set up in such a way, because we're not going to be building those houses, so those grants have been set up in such a way as to be able to drive the private sector role. I guess my answer to you was about the fact that, you know, we don't have a Ministry of Works. All of that public house building program involves contracting with others to be able to do that work. So Kaingaroa might be the contract holder and the contract head. It's a series of SMEs that are doing that work. And in many ways, what we were doing there by announcing that was saying that's our anchor for the sector. Beyond that, yes, we want to see that stimulated. You know this more than me. Land availability is obviously a critical issue there. Financing for people is a critical issue there, and obviously we've been supporting the banks and so on, and what the Reserve Bank has in terms of making sure there's financing available there for development as well. So all of those things are part of that picture of opening up that pipeline of residential construction from the beginning of next year, once these SMEs get through the checking out your kitchen and your bathroom.
Kirk.
Minister, you mentioned Kiwi Build. This might be a trite question. What are the lessons and what is the future?
Well, the lessons are clear in that when the construction of Kiwi Build as a policy happened at a very particular point in the market. And by the time Kiwi Build came to be implemented, the market was actually in a slightly different place. It's cycled back around now, and there are a number of developments that are there that are ready to go. We've tweaked some of the criteria, we've opened it up a bit, and look, I'm one of the ministers that's responsible, and I'm continuing, even in this period now, to sign off new developments. So those tweaks we think are going to make the program work well. At the same time, we've added a number of other elements to the toolbox, like the progressive home ownership. So taking some of that Kiwi Build allocation and saying, look, we actually think we can use this a better way. So, you know, lessons learned that a big idea like that sometimes needs to be delivered in smaller chunks and in different ways, and that we've got to make the criteria as flexible as we possibly can to work. But, you know, houses are being built, not at the volumes that we had hoped, but they are being built, and we're just going to continue to work with the private sector. I mean, this is the classic example. It's a partnership between the government and the private sector to deliver it. Both sides of the equation have to work together, but the market conditions, you know, need to be the right ones for the program to be delivered and have the outcomes we want.
Helen, I know that you had some thoughts around this.
I do have a few thoughts on that issue, surprisingly.
As it seems.
Having spent 9 months in it, donkey deep in the reset, I, got a really good insight into it. And I suppose, again, this is where the whole question of engaging with the private sector and the public sector and the private sector actually trusting one another in the design piece becomes fundamental, because the private sector could see where the problems were, but the public sector didn't necessarily believe them. And so that becomes a really big part of so it's that engagement, I think, that's really critical. But also, in the context of Kiwi Build as it stands today, That's a supply-based initiative, but it's focused on the eligibility is a very small slice of buyers. And I guess the question is, when the underwrite tool, I think, is brilliant because you get houses without spending a cent of government money if you get it right. But the key thing is making sure that you're getting the right product, right place, blah, blah, blah. The question, I guess, is it's a very small slice of buyers. Is there an appetite to widen that eligibility or the purposes for which those homes can be built? Because ultimately there's accommodation demand. It's not just first home buyer ownership demand.
Yeah, I think the point you make is the right one, which is that part of the reset with the underwrite tool was to try and open up what we were doing. And as I'm seeing the proposals now coming across my desk, they are mixed developments. So yes, there are Kiwi build homes in the development targeting the first home buyers that we're after, but also there's a range of other housing options in there as well. I think that's what you're talking about, isn't it? To use it as a leverage point to get in there. So no, I think having reset it, we want the reset to see it. But actually, I think using the underwrite tool and providing the opportunities for those mixed developments is a good one. One thing I would say, and one thing I would love to see more of, and again, it's not my direct portfolio, but it's something I am keeping a close eye on, is just Kāinga Ora using its role as beyond just the old Housing New Zealand role to be the facilitator of those partnerships across the economy. You know, there are so many different players, from community housing providers through to private sector developers, iwi, that we actually can be working with, and we've probably lacked in the system historically an agency that will push on. Housing New Zealand was very inwardly focused on what it's doing. Kāinga Ora is an urban development authority. It has certain powers, it has certain roles, and we want to see it use it and develop those over the next term.
It's very different DNA though.
It is, but
And
different
that's your
people are
challenge.
coming into it, and also MHUD's role is important here as well. And again, we haven't actually had a dedicated group of people focused around that particular role on housing outside of social housing. This comes back to Jahan's original point. In order to get the focus, you end up with the separate organisations. And so we have to bring that together. We are bringing that together. But I think having that focus is the flip side of the silo. It is actually useful because then those organisations get on with their jobs.
You've got your SMA, I suppose the big thing is where's your project manager?
Yeah. And obviously, we need to build up the skills of the people within those agencies. And as you said, listen to the private sector who've got that experience.
Let's take a question from Daryl.
Yeah, I'm encouraged to see that you mentioned procurement as part of the sector. I think from the sector's perspective, it's critical in achieving good outcomes. And the question really is, what's your view on achieving good outcomes through government procurement for its construction program, both vertical and horizontal?
Yeah, and this is where we do have to move away from that lowest cost model. I think it's caused us significant difficulty. Of course, we want to drive efficient outcomes and we want to get value for money for taxpayers out of what we're doing in our procurement. But just driving a race to the bottom on that has not worked for the sector, and it doesn't work for us either. So that's why we're going to this idea of a broader outcome model, which is actually in part about the sustainability of the sector, but also about environmental health and safety, all of those factors, but also job creation.
Risk.
Risk and sharing of risk, which was the big topic when we set the Accord up, was actually how do we get a better sharing of that risk and not dump it all down in terms of the contracting environment. So, fair pricing, fair margins. We don't want unexpected things to happen. We don't want people locking themselves into deals that are actually just completely unsustainable. So part of our job with local government as such big parts of procurement is if we can drive that quality of behaviour, we think it'll filter right across the sector. In terms of the broader way we do procurement, I have a background working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and it was drilled into all of us. Our trade agreements oblige us to make sure that we don't create disincentives to competition and so forth and so on. But what we can do, and what all of our trading partners do, is look at how what the government spends adds value inside the New Zealand economy, in the creation of jobs, in the taking on of apprentices. If the government's going to award a contract, it is sensible to say, well, we have an expectation that there will be a certain number of people in apprenticeships within that contract. That kind of role of both lifting quality, lifting standards, but also looking at how we can use that, you know, $40–50 billion worth of spend from a central government point of view to also help drive job creation, get to the SMEs so that they get a fair slice of what we're doing. So, you know, we're further developing those procurement rules as we go. Yes, we have to abide by our trade agreements and all of that, but it's clear that there's a pathway in here that can get a lot more value getting into New Zealand businesses and SMEs.
Yeah, I think considering sort of whole of life or whole of project, you know, procurement drives far better outcomes. It would be more cost effective, but also, you know, in the long term, I think it's a far better proposition.
So just on that issue, we've got a question that's come through here where somebody's asking, will the government, as part of those new procurement rules, ensure that locally produced materials are used as a matter of priority?
This has definitely been one of the issues that's been raised with us. There's two cross-cutting work streams going on here, which is the rules around standards of products and making sure that we have high standards but get more flexibility in delivery and more cost effectiveness. It is one of the great conversations around the cabinet table is why do building products cost so much in New Zealand relative to the rest of the world? It's one of those imponderables, but part of it is making sure that the regulatory system is both sound but also flexible, so that's one way that we do that. So yes, we'd like to use New Zealand products, but obviously the standards remain very, very important and making sure that New Zealanders have confidence in them. So yep, that would be part of our thinking, but alongside that work around the standards.
Minister, we touched briefly on this actually. I'd like to come back to it. It's the conflict, or the central government and local government. We've got 72-ish local authorities who've all got different ways of interpreting the Building Act, and you end up with weird issues with certification of products and with ultimately building consent standards. And that's a real problem when it comes to prefab, etc. Is that a big work stream for you as well?
100% is, and the only way we'll get the kind of sector transformation is getting more consistency, getting better understanding for all levels, from subcontractors all the way through, about some baseline rules. The RMA changes are about this as well, to try and blast through that. I know the Building Act stands alone from the RMA, but they interact with each other constantly, and that's one of the issues that we've certainly seen at a local government. Capability of local government around processing consents and so on. There's some really good tools that are out there that are used by some local authorities, but they're not always shared, and so we have been talking to local government in New Zealand about that. Well, I used to have an architect who'd come and see me once every few months at my constituency clinics to show me the different piles for exactly the same design across 3 different councils with 3 completely different ways of dealing with the consent. We have to do better on that.
Just on that, if you ask anyone out there doing the work, what's their biggest hurdle? The regulatory system is that, and it's the biggest contributor to the economic loss in the building and construction sector. So when we talk about affordability and productivity, does the Labor government have an appetite to centralise that consenting system and that regulatory system, to streamline it, to gain back some of those losses around the economy and the productivity through that?
I think that is where the reform of the RMA comes in, because it is actually about, the report that we've had has basically said we do need greater consistency across New Zealand. Obviously, local government local authorities have different views about how they see their communities developing. We need to protect that local input, but when it comes to the way that you as a person are interacting, we've got to get more consistency within that.
So are you saying that your government does have an appetite to centralise that system?
I think the centralising of the whole consenting system is unlikely, but getting the rules consistent everywhere and the process consistent everywhere, we can do without necessarily centralising it all into.
Because currently speaking, we've got all these BCAs that struggle to get that consistency. So I don't know that, just meddling with the same system is going to achieve the result that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think some of it will when we provide far more work around standards, templates, that can be used. There has been a reluctance to do some of that. The RMA has driven that, but I think now that we are going to reform it, I think we will get over a lot of that.
Helen, I'd just like to ask you a little bit about your experience, because we talked about this earlier, that stepping stone in between public and private. Can you explain what your experience was? What were some of the frustrations that you experienced, and how do you think those could be navigated better?
So I guess I was a private sector person working in the public sector, and my overwhelming experience was that the public sector, tends to, generalising wildly, public sector tends to look at the private sector and think we're all looking for an angle, a subsidy or some kind of, special route to profitability, whereas the private sector looks at the public sector and thinks they're just trying to invent red tape for red tape's sake because it makes them happy. What I found though is when you're in a position that there is mutual trust, my experience, would be in a development process, and I'd be able to say, that's not how that works. It's actually blah, blah, blah. And these really brainy, committed, passionate people would look at me, you'd see the cogs whirring, and they'd go, well, that means X, Y, and Z. And it just those little opportunities to provide trusted input at those points was the bit that made a lot of the difference.
Do you think part of that comes from the point at the process in which we involve people?
Yes.
Because it's always struck me that in a lot of what government does, we involve people at the latest possible stage.
Here's a brilliant thing. Admire it.
And I've spent a lot of time working on it, and I don't really want to change it. Whereas that more kind of ground up development, and I'm a bit like a broken record here, but that's the philosophy of the Accord, was actually to go back to the basics of it and say, well, what is it that we're trying to achieve?
What's the problem we're trying to solve?
And so, but I do think that, the histories of the people matter here, and, these things do take a bit of time, but I think the best way of building out trust is to experience things together. That's my relationship advice for the night. But I think the same thing applies when it comes to the way that we see the sector developing, is that actually if we start it from the ground up, and the Accord is a great vehicle, and, it puts people in the same room together who wouldn't have been in the same room together.
I'd like to put through, just a couple of quick questions from our audience here. Minister, there's one question. Lots of talk about new construction. There's a massive pool of existing housing which does not meet acceptable standards, cold, needing re-roofing and insulating. What stimulus is available?
So the Warm Up Kiwi Homes program is available and has been there for some time. That's a subsidy program for people to be able to do that kind of work. We want to continue with that. It's been a really good program. Obviously, we're doing that same work within our own housing stock, within the state housing stock. So, we'll continue to provide the support that we have in those areas.
There are many failed prefab companies. Why would another want to get into the industry, and how would small companies be able to access their products?
Yeah, look, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in this area. It's a detailed area within other people's portfolios. There's some people on the panel who might be able to answer that question better than me. What I do know from our side of the coin, and this comes to what we were talking about before, we do want to see some kind of nationwide consenting process around prefabricated housing, because it's a new area. It's one where we do want more people involved. It is really important to us. At the moment, it has suffered from not having that. So that would be the thing I can do to contribute to that. In terms of that, I don't know, do we have any views on what someone who's a new player in the sector might be able to do?
I don't have the answer either, so.
Someone else has asked, what is the single biggest obstacle, in your view, of improving productivity in the building sector? What's the single biggest obstacle?
I mean, for me, it comes back to skills and training and having people, in the sector able to do that. Productivity in any part of society is driven largely by skills, by research and development, by making sure you've got the quality infrastructure to back up what you do. For me, the bit that I feel like I can help with a lot there is making sure that we have, a workforce coming through that's well trained, that's there, and that's able to support people to, improve their work.
Daryl.
Yeah, can I suggest though that I suppose in my world, I think productivity is probably there's probably more productivity gains to be had before you get to the site. So in a lot of the regulatory stuff, and so from concept, from idea through to actually start of construction, yes, there is some gains in construction, but I think I think you could sort of put 60-70% of the gains in productivity to be had before you get to the site.
Yeah, and look, as I say, we've got that program around regulatory and legislative reform, which is designed to support that. Yeah.
All right. Minister, we know that we need to let you get back to the beehive, so thanks very much for making the trip across town and making time for this discussion today. It's been really great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, well, we'll be hearing very shortly from the National Finance spokesperson, Paul Goldsmith. He'll be joining us to take your questions and also to take some curly questions from our panel. A reminder as well that our fourth and final session in this year's Constructive will be coming up next week, the same day at the same time. We'll be talking about business resilience. So we'll be looking at some of the wider issues that have been picked up from our conversation over the last few weeks. Of course, if you've been joining us for these sessions, you'll know that we've been talking about the commercial sector. We've also been talking about residential, and we've been looking at what are the policy decisions that are going to be needed to ensure the viability, the security of the sector in the coming months. We've heard a lot from some of you actually who've been finding these discussions useful. You've been sending us comments afterwards, and a reminder as well that these sessions are available straight after we do them live here in Wellington on the Constructive website if you'd like to rewatch them or share them. So it's time now for our next speaker. It is National's finance spokesperson, the Honourable Paul Goldsmith. Now, Paul entered national politics in 2011. After the 2014 general election, he was appointed Minister of Commerce and Consumer Affairs and Associate Minister for ACC. In 2016, Paul was appointed Minister of Tertiary Education, Skills and Employment, Science and Innovation and Regulatory Reform. It's quite a list. He is now the opposition spokesperson on finance and also the Earthquake Commission. Paul, welcome. Thanks very much for being here.
Thank you very much, and it's a great opportunity for me to talk to this sector, the construction sector, who are a critical part of the economy, one of the greatest employers in the economy, but also men and women across the country that make real differences to people's lives in terms of providing houses and building in which we work and live and play. We often think of ourselves in politics as being in public service. I always take the view that there's no greater public service than remaining and succeeding in business, because you only remain and succeed in business if you give people what they want at the right price, and it's all about service. And your sector, which is delivering things that last for decades and delivering quality products that people use and live in and cherish and hold big parts of their wealth, is a critical one. And so it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about the issues that are important to you. And of course, we're in the middle of an extraordinary period, 2020, and a time when our economy has been shrinking dramatically. And if we think about, we're going to hear next week what the second quarter GDP figures are, and there's a range of possibilities. The Australians just announced that their economy had shrunk by 7% in the second quarter, and we're deeply anxious about that. The Reserve Bank has been predicting it could be closer to 14% here. I heard some figures that range from about 12 to 18%, much more substantial shrinking of the New Zealand economy in that period. And one of the main reasons for that was the severity of our lockdown and the fact that construction was stopped during our level 4 lockdown, and it wasn't in Australia. And so that's one way of just reflecting on the significance of this sector and an important part of what it is. And it was great that we've got back on track, and there's a huge amount of work going on. We've also seen the massive loss of jobs across the economy. Last fortnight, more than 5,000 people joined the unemployment benefits in this country. There's been nearly 80,000 since March, and predictions of many more. And so that is obviously creating enormous pressure on many New Zealand families, making it more difficult for people to provide for themselves and their families, and very difficult in many respects, losing one's job, having real impact on small businesses as well. Many people have spent their lifetime building up a small business and for no fault of their own have really seen many of them have been tipped upside down during the lockdown period. So it's been a dramatic time. And also at the government level, we've seen this incredible increase in debt. Government has been borrowing about $1.3 billion a week. Is projected to between March and the end of the year, a doubling of our net core debt, roughly from about 60 billion to 120 billion. We're on the way to 200 billion. People's eyes glaze over when you talk about those numbers. What does that mean? What does it mean? But if you think about it, we spend about $1 billion a year on the Pharmac budget to provide all the drugs and pharmaceuticals to help keep us alive and to save lives and cancer and all that area, $1 billion a year. And so we're borrowing 1.3 a week. Gives you a sense of the scale of the situation that we're facing. Now, that borrowing, much of it has been through things such as the wage subsidy and increased support for New Zealand families, which we naturally support, and that's exactly what you would expect to do during a downturn such as this. But the critical thing is to get through this period, spend that money wisely, and then have a plan to grow the economy so we can get back on track and then eventually get back on top of the debt. So we've seen a huge rise, and we've also, of course, related to that, been seeing extremely low interest rates, and I'm sure it's of interest to your whole sector what impact that will have, particularly in the residential space, when you've got these two different factors at play. Obviously, if unemployment rises, continues to rise, then that has a real impact on demand for housing and the ability of people to service their mortgages. On the other hand, with interest rates extremely low, there is hugely stimulatory for the market and for opportunities for people to get into the housing market. And then you've got this great uncertainty around the immigration flows. Not much general immigration coming into the country, but a lot of New Zealanders returning home from overseas, and that's having a real impact. So it's a very, very difficult time for anybody to work out what's going to be happening next year, and that uncertainty is nothing that you can deal with easily. So if we look forward, then how do I see things? What's our focus? Our focus really, particularly in the economic space, is on jobs. It's around keeping taxes low, and it's around delivering a quality infrastructure that will make a big difference to the country. And they all very much relate to this sector. So if you think about jobs, where do we create the jobs to replace the ones that we're losing? And construction, of course, is a huge area, fourth largest employer. I suppose the difference between us and the current government is that there is a tendency in the current government, I think, to think that you get jobs by government borrowing money and going and buying those jobs in various programs to hunt possums, plant flax bushes, various projects around the country. And there is a role for that as a stimulus during a crisis, but fundamentally the long-term sustainable jobs primarily come from private sector investment. Somebody somewhere putting their hand in their pocket and say, I'm going to start a new business, I'm going to expand my business, I'm going to take on extra people, take a risk, start something new. And the recipe for that to happen hasn't changed. It's about keeping taxes low. It's about pushing back against the tide of regulation that keeps piling on. And the obvious place to start in that area is around the RMA. And for the first time in recent memory, just about everybody in Parliament agrees that the RMA needs to go and be replaced. But I wouldn't underestimate the stark disagreement about what should replace it. And I think there is a very real risk that if there was a Labour-Greens government or even a Labour government after the election, the new replacement for the RMA would be even worse when it comes to getting things done. It will be more bureaucratic, whereas we're very much focused on trying to enable things to happen. You've got to say yes in response to a few more questions than no all the time. So low taxes, pushing back on regulation. Consistency around policy is critical as well. And, we think of one example of that is the oil and gas decision, where a big change affecting a multi-billion-dollar sector was made with no analysis at all and no consultation with the industry, just announced by the Prime Minister, and then it just happened. We think about consistency as it affects this sector. We didn't hear the Minister talking much about Kiwi Build until the question sessions. But of course, it is worth remembering, notwithstanding the promise of 100,000 houses, the number is, I think, might have got up to 400. It's in the high 300s. That's actually fewer houses than the Prime Minister's ill-conceived intervention at Ihumātao has stopped being built over there. So they've actually stopped more houses being built at Ihumātao by interfering with that process on private land with private developers than the entire Kiwi Build project has delivered so far. And the huge uncertainty that sort of intervention and the fact that it hasn't been resolved yet after more than a year and keeps rolling on, to me, you can talk about being consultative and collaborative with the sector and doing everything and saying nice words, but it's the actions that count. And the action in that particular area has been to make it obviously impossible for the development of those houses and sending a signal that there's a question mark now about a whole bunch of things that needs to be resolved. So very, very dangerous territory there. The other area is around foreign investment. And the government's been very, during the crisis, passed emergency legislation, making it even more difficult for foreign investment to come into the country. Has to go through a notification regime, more hoops, more fire to get through in order to get money into the country. And naturally, New Zealanders have a concern around land ownership, but the country fundamentally has also been built on capital coming into the country, investing in businesses, growing businesses, providing jobs and opportunities for New Zealanders. So we think they've gone too far there. On the skills, in terms of where you get the jobs for, a big part of that is delivering good quality skills. And we're supportive of the investment in apprentices, and we've obviously ramped that up severely over the last few years. We are worried about the massive transformation that's going on in that sector, turning the whole area upside down at a critical time. I don't think is a wise thing to be doing at a time when we need to be getting skilled workers coming out. The BCITO was a good institution. It's now everything's in a state of flux at a time when we need to be training more people. So there's two sort of things going: lots of money being poured in, lots of calling for apprentices, but at the same time, the industry has been put through upheaval. I do think, though, at a broader level, and I remember giving this speech to the boys at Auckland Grammar a couple of years ago. There is a mindset change required across the country. We still have a tendency with parents and teachers to think the only success in life is for their kids to go to university and go down a particular track. And there's no question in my mind that we need to put greater emphasis as a community and a society on the technical trades and skills as a way to earn a great living, start your own business and contribute to New Zealand. And much more emphasis should be put on that in a positive way, not as an escape route for people who haven't achieved in other areas, but as a worthy purpose in itself, attracting some of the best and brightest. Incredibly complicated areas of business and trade that are dealt with in the property sector. We want the best, some of the best and brightest and most enthusiastic and talented and entrepreneurial young kids going into that sector and encouraging them to do that. And that's an important mindset shift that's required. On debt and taxes, obviously it's highly relevant. We've got a clear contrast between Labour that wants to put them up and a National Party that's determined to keep taxes low and adjust the tax rates for inflation. The big, funnily enough, and also something that perhaps people haven't quite cottoned on to, we're very keen to significantly in the short term increase the amount of new investment that can be written off immediately up to $150,000 per asset as a way to encourage those businesses with resources to invest in new plant and machinery to grow and to become more productive. And that will be of use to many businesses in this sector as well. But when it comes to tax, the government's pitch is vote for us and we'll make somebody else pay more tax. My simple point would be to say, just remember that a government that can't control its spending will eventually come after you as well and reach further into middle New Zealand. And certainly in conjunction with the Greens, who thinks that tax is love and certainly want more of it. On the infrastructure side, we often think of roads and things in terms of infrastructure. The biggest piece of infrastructure that I think the previous government delivered was the ultra-fast broadband, which has had a huge impact on our ability to get through this difficult time and have been a great success, and there's still more work to be done there. Obviously, we've outlined huge investment plans for roads and transport, and that's critical in terms of productivity of the country. People often think, well, how are we going to improve the productivity of New Zealand? How are we going to get these higher incomes? I often think of the humble concrete mixer in Auckland. Might have been able to do four or five return trips a day, but now, thanks to congestion in the city, might struggle to do 2 or 3. And it's just a simple measure of showing, well, that's actually how our productivity is impinged by poor quality transport planning and congestion. And our worry is that we had a good pipeline of work in place, and they were all cancelled by the government when they came in. Julian Genta didn't want to give in to the car fascists. Phil Twyford said we'd overinvested in roads. Shane Jones loves roads, but only in Northland. The combination of those three led to a stop. And then 2 years later, and we all waited for the slow tram to come down Dominion Road, then 2 years later, nothing's happened on the slow train, and they restarted the roads. But a lot of the workers and the people involved in that sector have drifted off in the meantime. And so we've got to be more consistent there. We've also outlined plans to spend $4.8 billion over the next 10 years in school building, and a huge, highly relevant to the commercial sector, a real opportunity because of growing roles of kids and students to continue to build over an extended period of time. And we need to do that in a smarter way. I just as a local MP, it always amazes me that I go to the local school and every board seems to be designing their own bespoke classrooms, engaging their own architects, doing things all separately themselves, hiring somebody that and then rebuilding them in a few years' time because they leak. I think there is huge opportunity for much better procurement across that sector and to get more effective outcomes. Hospital sector is another area where we need to do that. We hope to be less, more predictable and based on need and requirement in the way that these things have gone. I think the whole green school episode reinforced that there has been a real element of I think an unhelpful element of political sort of everybody having their turn to have their share in the coalition government we've seen. Started off with the Provincial Growth Fund and Shane Jones's naked assertion that to the victor goes the spoils. It was how that was divided up, and that's no way to, I think, build confidence in government stimulatory measures such as this, and we've seen a response to that. The final thing I just want to mention before we go to questions is around yesterday. Yes, was it yesterday? Yesterday we talked about our National Infrastructure Bank as a means to help with the development or innovation and handling of some of the finances that have the financial aspects of investment that we need if we take that long-term view of the infrastructure across the economy, which includes things such as water and roads and many of the other areas. And that's sort of grown a little bit out of the Crown Infrastructure Partners idea, where because councils have been up against their debt levels, it's been difficult to start new subdivisions, for housing subdivisions, for example, because they haven't been able to get the water and the road in. You're having to wait for too long a time. So the Milldale experiment under our previous government, which enabled a targeted rate to finance that work, to get it happening faster is something that I'm pleased that this current government has picked up as well and expanded on. And we need, across the economy, much more innovation in the way that we fund this kind of infrastructure in order to get the houses built. Because the big challenge for New Zealand is, when we look at quality of life, is very much around the housing affordability that we have. I think the overwhelming focus in response to that should be on doing everything we can to reduce the cost of building and providing new houses. And that's partly about RMA reform, but it's also about looking systematically at the cost structure across the sector and improving the productivity, and also enabling New Zealanders to have the incomes in order to sustain that as well. So that's by way of introduction, and very happy to answer any sort of questions as we go along. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Paul. Come and join us down here, and we'd love to hear from our panel, their thoughts on what they've just heard from Paul Goldsmith, and also questions from you at home. Feel free to send them through via our app as well. Let's go to Helen first. Helen, what were your thoughts?
Thank you, Paul, for the really, some great philosophical content there. I guess in terms of detailed policy for the sector and what kind of interventions you would see as being timely in terms of, over the next 6 to 12 months, maintaining momentum in the residential construction sector in conjunction with the private sector, ways that actually keeps that private sector moving at a time when the uncertainty to which you alluded is a kind of cloud that hangs over all of that sector. Do you have any kind of timelines on, interventions you might propose in that space to keep that momentum going?
Yeah, well, look, I think the critical thing, as I say, is there is the thing that everybody is grappling with is the uncertainty created by the COVID crisis, and so the most fundamental thing any government can do is do everything you can to reduce the risk of going back into a debilitating lockdown. And to destroy even more jobs. And so that's the obvious sort of starting point about actually securing the border effectively and making sure we've got the testing and tracing in place so that we can, that going back into a lockdown is the very last resort rather than the first lever to be pulled. And then, of course, it's about maintaining confidence. Recognising that we have got enormous stimulatory activity going on in terms of monetary policy, with interest rates and mortgages being as low as possible. So the demand is being pushed along by that, as well as the enormous amount of government borrowing that is being pushed into the economy, quite appropriately through the wage subsidy, but in other areas as well. And so I suppose then when it comes to specific things that governments can do, to help in that sector around particularly commercial work, and as we talked about in those. Everybody talks about shovel-ready projects. Our sort of slight cynicism has been that government's been world-class at announcing these projects, but they've been actually very slow to deliver on them. That's partly a function of the infighting within the coalition parties, as we're seeing with James Shaw and New Zealand First. But also, I think a lack of clarity around what's been, chopping and changing around what's been focused on, particularly if you look in the road and transport area. And so our desire would be to be sort of clearer about that, and we've outlined already, and we haven't sort of come out with, so we haven't done our housing policy as yet, but what we've talked about in the infrastructure space in terms of education, and school facilities in the health sector and in the broader infrastructure space is an enormous amount of government investment in this space over the next few years. Obviously, it's not going to solve every problem in the next few months, and that's why in that space the best thing you can do is concentrate on the COVID response and a continuation of normal economic activity.
So you wouldn't see any immediate interventions in the residential housing sector in the short term.
What sort of interventions are you talking about?
Well, speaking of consumer confidence, it's quite important. I mean, the industry or sector lives and breathes on consumer confidence, and with that being quite low, with low unemployment levels,
Sure.
and that the residential space will need direct stimulus policy. So, I mean, the question would be, how will you create that if you're not looking to inject it?
Well, I mean, the most important thing you can do is focus on stopping job losses as much as you can, and encouraging new people to have new jobs to be created. And if you look at the two biggest stimuluses, aside from writing out cheques, but at a time when we're borrowing $1.3 billion a week already, frankly, we are limited in the amount of extra cheques that we can continue to write out at the moment. But so, the biggest stimuluses are the low interest rates and having a job. In terms of encouraging people to invest in houses. And that's why it's so important to come back to the practical realities around that. And so, if you take, for example, in TY, there are more than 2,000 jobs in Southland now under threat, and the government is determined for a host of reasons just to let that happen. I think we need to be a bit more pragmatic about that at a time when we're losing so many jobs. And there's equivalent things going on in Taranaki, in New Zealand Steel, and up the country. And so in terms of those industrial jobs, I think we need to be a little bit more pragmatic about hanging on to some of those jobs in the short term. And then about where you create those jobs, it's about encouraging investment in small business and not continuing to pile on costs in that area. And again, if we think of what's happened this week, we've had announced a new public holiday, which is great. Everybody loves public holidays, but if you're a small business trying to employ people, well, that makes it tougher. And we've seen extra taxes being announced, and today we've seen a 100% renewable electricity supplies. Well, that again, a very nice thing to have, but involves fundamentally higher energy costs, because if you want to achieve that, you really have to build an enormous amount of excess capacity, and that all flows through to the cost structure of the economy. So, a long way of answering it, but I think you can't go past getting the basics right when it comes to the economy.
Terrell?
You mentioned a huge investment in infrastructure and also your infrastructure bank. I think there's a leaning towards the terminology infrastructure to refer to horizontal.
Sure.
So how would you ensure that there would be an appropriate balance between vertical and horizontal infrastructure investment?
Well, not just vertical. I'll come to your vertical, but when I think of infrastructure, I think of digital infrastructure as well being critical to the way. When I think of health infrastructure, I think digital infrastructure underpinning the health system is as important as the bricks and mortar. But when we come to the vertical infrastructure, is obviously the biggest levers that the government can pull is around that huge education and health sector. And there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done. We saw Judith Collins just up the road in the Hawke's Bay earlier this week talking about that hospital there, which needs to be fundamentally rebuilt. And we're prepared to do that. And I think a lot of people will recognise, if you look at the arc of history at difficult times like this, some of those real nation-building bits of work that stand the test of time are done during those difficult times, and that's where I see the big opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's, in simple terms, it's probably no good having a nice road to go to a failing hospital.
True, but but you've got to do all these things. And when I think of in our transport infrastructure, the most kind of visionary thing there is this the basic sort of idea of trying to connect the 2.5 million people who live between Whangarei, Tauranga and Hamilton, half of the population of the country, and connecting them properly. You'd think it's a basic thing that we need to do, connecting them properly with a 4-lane highway so you can get from Auckland to Tauranga in less than 2 hours, and unleash the potential of that vast area to become what I think could be one of the most dynamic regions in Australasia. And if you do that, I mean, the ability for development and building and construction work that comes along with that development, if you could properly connect that region, I think is colossal. And so that is why I think that transport underpinning is critical.
Yeah. This government is borrowing a lot of money. You're going to be borrowing a lot of money as well, aren't you? I mean, 4.8 billion just for fixing up these schools. Have you properly costed these policies, and are you confident that you'll have the cash to roll them out?
Was that question sent through from Grant Robertson?
It wasn't.
Look, absolutely.
Have they been independently costed?
Next week we've got the pre-election fiscal update that comes out, and in the days after that we'll be putting out our overall set of numbers. There's so many movable parts prior to the preview that we think it makes sense to do that. And in the broad sense, what you'll see is that I think everybody recognises that during this crisis, it does make sense to borrow more and spend in order to help sustain the economy and avoid a complete crash or boom and bust environment. But then we have also set a goal to get that overall government debt down over the next decade in preparation for the inevitable next crisis that comes along. And you'll see that as a point of difference between us and the current government, that we'll take a more disciplined approach to spending over the extended period in order to get our debt back under control. And look, it's interesting to note we hear lots about debt, and the point I should just remind people is that prior to COVID, this government came in, they had inherited massive surpluses that had been built up with Bill English and Stephen Joyce and the previous national government. Within 2 years, prior to COVID coming along, they were projecting a deficit for this year. And that is because there has not been that fundamental restraint and control on overall spending. And if you do that, and you continue to do that, then New Zealanders have fewer options down the line. And so it is important to set a path back to getting our debt and our economic finances under control.
Kirk.
Yeah, well, Daryl stole a couple of my questions. Actually, I just want to return to the comment about roads, because the comment that I wrote about roads, what about connecting communities? And you've partially answered that, but by saying, you'll deal with the RMA, although that might be a fairly long-winded process, or might be quite quick, depending on how you deal with it. What about the other component that we've talked about that particularly impacts the building and construction sector, and that's local government? What are your plans there? And I know that's not your portfolio area, but it has a significant impact on overall economic activity, and the disconnects between central government, local government, communities and the private sector, particularly in this sector, have led to some pretty poor outcomes.
Yes, it has. And prior to politics, I used to write biographies of businesses. I did one on Fletcher's and various other New Zealand businesses. And one of the striking things I remembered was 2010. I was writing a book on Bill Gallagher, who exports electric fences and security systems around the world. And I was also on the Auckland Council, City Council, the last council before the super city. And it was at the time of the Canterbury earthquakes, and insurance premiums went through the roof. And I remember Bill Gallagher saying, "Oh heck, my insurance has gone up $1 million a year. I've got to find savings somewhere else in the system, because my customers don't care about insurance in New Zealand. They just want the same thing at the same price, and they work very hard to get the cost out of somewhere else in the system in order to cover the cost of the insurance." Then you go along to the council meeting and, oh dear, our insurance has gone up, we'll have to put the rates up because it's a council cost of inflation, we can't do anything about it. It's either that or we close the libraries. And that kind of mindset, unfortunately, is a part of that whole government and also local government sector. And so it is, I think, an area where the incentives have over time evolved, whereby the easiest thing for many council regulators is to say no and to drag their heels and to draw things out and to be ultra conservative. And that has added a colossal amount of cost and frustration to building and construction sector. And so I think that is one of the challenges for us to unwind, and it's not an easy thing to do. I think the lesson of Kiwi builders, politicians coming in and saying they're going to solve these things overnight, is a powerful one that we're going to adopt. But I think over time, over the past, there has been a tendency for governments to see local government as a relatively minor thing for a junior minister to look at, and it just bubbles away in the background. And I think that's wrong. I think it is one of the core challenges for the country to get local government sector working efficiently and effectively, and getting the structures right, so we attract capable people into governance roles in the local government sector who can hold the bureaucracies to account, and that the systems that we have encourage councils to be welcoming of investment rather than seeing it as a problem to overcome.
Given what you've just said, though, your building and construction spokesperson is at number 44 on your list. Does National actually value this sector?
Absolutely, and I think it's a fair point to say that it has been a reasonably tumultuous period over the last few months in politics, as it has right across the economy, and we've certainly been through some rapid changes, and so there's no question once we get through this and get to form a government in 6 weeks' time, then we'll have a chance to ensure that we have all the spokespeople in the right place. Obviously, when you've got a very large caucus like we have of 55 people, you want to give roles to as many people as possible, and it's a different setting to when you're in a government and you have a cabinet of 20.
We're having some questions coming through. I'll just ask a couple of the ones that are coming through from people who are watching. Would National keep the construction sector a cord?
Yeah, look, I mean, we think there's a lot of merit in that, and as a general rule, I don't think the country is served greatly if every time the government changes, the new government comes along and sweeps everything out that the previous government had done, because we don't like it, and starting afresh. And so, we try and build on that, and the broad impetus behind it of the sector working collaboratively with government to sort of work on priorities and systematically work through the challenges that we face, we agree with. And like I say, it's very easy to talk about this stuff, but it's your actions that count.
You heard what the Minister said earlier around new procurement rules for government. What is your view on the government's role as a client at present, and what changes would you like to see?
Well, the government, of course, is one of the biggest purchasers of construction in the country, obviously. And as stewards of taxpayers' money, we want to make sure that we're getting value for money. But obviously, it's the whole of life costs of the investment that matter, not just the initial purchasing. And so, we experimented in previous government with various ways of doing that, building prisons and schools through PPPs, and I think we do need to continue to experiment in different ways of doing that. And I absolutely agree with the broad sort of contention that a procurement system that just leans far too heavily just to the initial price without a clear sort of sense of the lifetime costs of buildings is inappropriate.
But specifically, how would you like to see reform in that area in terms of the government's role? What would you like to see change in the government's role as a client?
Well, the thing that I would be keen to see is more cohesion, not just one central agency that decides everything, but as I indicated when I was talking in the school zone, I do think we've erred a little bit too far to the end of every school doing things their own way and contracting their own way, and boards of trustees being deeply involved in the decisions about where the cupboards go and all that. I think we've gone too far down that decentralised route, and we could benefit from a little bit more coherency and I suppose areas of absolute expertise within the government system around procurement. And I think it's very ill spread at the moment, and I think there is a real opportunity. I'm not going to announce a particular specific plan.
But that's an important point. So,
Sure.
if you're talking about coherence, what would that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, well, that is something that we'll be talking about more in the future. This is a bit like Morning Report. Did you work with Radio New Zealand before? What we'd be looking at is for opportunities, structural opportunities to get that working more effectively. And I'm not going to sort of outline the exact sort of nature of that, but a sense of direction here today is to say that the current highly decentralised way of doing things, and it's the same in the hospital, in the DHB sectors as well. You get a DHB that once every 50 years builds a new hospital, doesn't have necessarily the procurement expertise internally, and I think there is room for better advice to be and guidance to come from the centre, and that is part of the role of the Infrastructure Commission that we have supported being set up. I worry a little. I think there is an opportunity for more guidance to come from that in the future as it evolves. At the moment, I worry that it might be a little bit sort of too high level and theoretical, and I think it needs to get sort of a little bit more into the nuts and bolts of really helping in that sector.
Darryl?
So I think we've touched on procurement, and it was just, I think we've sort of basically, we've pushed it a bit. It was just about what's your view on achieving good outcomes for the government procurement program, the construction program. I think we talked a bit before about a more collaborative approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the only observation I'd make is that, you know, what we're doing at the moment certainly shows room for improvement. If you took the education sector as one area, you know, the reality is that there's an enormous amount of building work that's being done that's having to be redone in a short space of time, and it's not necessarily be done in the most efficient manner, and so I think there is real scope for improvement. And that's not to say that it's the industry's fault that they haven't got it right. I think there is fault on both sides, and I think. And it's trite to say, but you know, more collaboration between the sector and the purchasers of it is obviously the place to start. And I think a little bit more guidance and consistency across the country in terms of the design. You know, not everybody having a crack, but having much more sort of focused templates to build on, and then linking that through with the consenting process, so we're not having to go through the same hoops of fire every time we do that. I think is an important part of it, and also, you know, recognising that you know. It's very easy for governments in the search for perfection to add costs through regulatory requirements, and then not recognise that means that, you know, fundamentally a lot less work that is actually done for the benefit of all the students. And we're seeing that obviously in the rental space as well. In, you know, that a whole lot of legislation has been passed, which all on its own makes great sense. You know, more higher standards around insulation and rules for tenants and so forth. But if it's all done too quickly, the net outcome means withdrawal from the market of some landlords and prices going up because there's a short-term shortage of demand. And so that relationship between intentions and realities and unexpected consequences of those regulations is an important area where I think we could do a lot better.
All right, we're out of time actually. Paul Goldsmith, thanks very much for coming in. We really appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. All right, we're now going to spend some time with our panellists just to wrap up today to hear their thoughts on what they've heard. Let's start with you, Kirk, and we'll start with Grant Robertson's comments earlier. What did you make of what he had to say? What landed and what didn't?
Well, I think, as I said at the time, you know, there are clearly the government has made a lot of announcements. They've got a significant program of work underway in this sector. Their challenge all along, as alluded to by Paul Goldsmith, is the inability to actually execute it. And you know, that the challenge that they'll face is the spectre of Kiwi Build, in my view, in their ability to deploy resources, although they demonstrated some capability and capacity to be able to do that during COVID. The question is whether they would be able to retain that as an incoming government. Pretty good program of work. I mean, it's pretty hard to challenge, from an interventionist perspective, pretty hard to challenge that. There's a lot of stuff going on to support the sector and a lot of money going into the sector, and including to deal with those, those peaks and troughs that have been a burden for so long. So I think their challenge will be the one that they've faced as a government. Whether they face it as a second-term government, if they get there, is to be seen.
Helen, that was a pretty feeble attempt to defend KiwiBuild, wasn't it, from Grant Robertson? Do you think they've just given up on trying to tell that story?
I think one of the challenges with KiwiBuilds, and I'm not sure that the intent or the intent of it's really been recognised in terms of what it has achieved, in terms of what it's enabled. I don't think that message has ever come across terribly well. I think that the target was always oversold, but the practical reality of using that underwrite tool, the thing is, it could never do 100,000 because there's not that many first home buyers in the world. The use of that underwrite tool as a next step, I think there was a little bit of, I didn't actually mean, using KiwiBuild to hold up the whole sector. My comment was more about using the tools they've used in KiwiBuild to keep this sector moving. That has to be for a wider audience than just the KiwiBuild qualified buyer, because that's an incredibly important part of it.
What did you make of what Grant Robertson had to say about that public-private collaboration that we talked about, the relationship there?
I took a lot of positives out of that in terms of recognising the challenge. The challenge for everybody, I think, including us as the private sector, is stepping up to be part of that solution, and the construction sector accord has given us a good template. I don't know that a lot of people bought into it or believed it terribly much when it first came out. There was a lot of, it's just another working group, but it has actually proven itself as a vehicle, and I think the challenge is quite rightly put to us as the private sector to join in with that kind of activity. And again, we've all astonished ourselves in our own organisations with what we can do when we absolutely have to. And the challenge for all of us, I think, is to take that can do into will do over the next, 3 years.
Johnny, what's your view on the ground based on what you heard there?
Oh, look, I think there's, particularly with Grant, there's some positives, and I think if we look at KiwiBuild, they're not going to talk about it extensively, but they've probably understood that, or they've learned some lessons from not partnering with the industry early. And we talked about that key collaboration between the private and the public sector meeting to get good outcomes. So hopefully that, moving forward, if they are the next government, that there'll be greater collaboration nice and early. Look, there's productivity is probably another lesson that they learnt through KiwiBuild, and the lack of it. So I think they understand the issues. It was interesting to see that he didn't rule out some form of centralised system or streamlined system around our consenting and local government regulatory systems. So look, there's work to be done, but there was a few good signals there.
And Daryl, what about procurement?
Yeah, I just thought on a whole, I think there needs to be a real connect between what the Minister says and what their staff does, and then how it filters down to the engagement through the industry. And I think the construction sector accord is the vehicle that's basically facilitated that engagement. But it's, as has been said, there's a great work program, there's a huge amount of stuff there. To actually turn it into meaningful stuff within government, within the bowels of government itself, and then to have the engagement with the industry, I think is the real challenge. Because if a chunk of what Minister Robertson said comes to fruition, the sector will be in a pretty good spot. The challenge is actually distilling that out and getting the engagement. Actually asking the sector, what do you guys think about this? And then in a meaningful way, listen to the responses
It's the early contractor engagement model we've been talking about, sort of across sector.
Well,
yeah, but it's the same in designing policy responses to a degree.
Yeah, and it's in a simple terms, you know, if you ask the practitioners the best way to do something, you'll get the answer. Then you help facilitate that.
Was there anything missing there that you would have liked to have heard from the Minister?
Look, I think that with, you know, everyone's talking about spending, but we need to encourage, you know, the talk about affordability and residential. Well, saturation of the market will assist that, productivity and saturation of the market. So they're going to need to look to raise the caps and the accessibility to the residential space for the people that can't touch it. Interest rates sort of don't really hit the mark for people entering the market. They've still got to get to a certain threshold, so that helps out the people buying and selling, but I think that there's a little bit of a missing link there.
And Paul Goldsmith, Kirk, what did you reckon?
Well, I mean, look, I think Paul gave a pretty clear explanation of where National sit from an economic perspective. One of the most interesting things for me, because if you know Paul well, you know he's kind of on the right of the National Party, but as the economic spokesperson, he talked about intervention. He talked about centralisation, and if you think about some of the things that he announced, or the National have announced, that $4.8 billion spend into the education sector for maintenance and buildings, that he was a bit canny about how that might be deployed. But you may recall that Hekia Parada had tried to use hubs as opposed to single school systems. So there is a history there of trying to not fully centralise, but use greater mechanisms for building scale, for procurement in particular areas. And I think that for me was the interesting difference perhaps that we might have seen between, you know, the Paul Goldsmith of old and I think this Paul Goldsmith, and also the observation that, you know, that National would still have to borrow money, that their debt repayments would be shorter. I mean, I guess the challenge with that is, you know, how you do it. They you know, he's outlined a fairly standard, I think, economic framework for delivering growth. But that's not to say that it wouldn't work. You know, and it certainly worked for National after the GFC.
Daryl, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I thought he talked about centralising a lot of stuff, which I think, you know, to a certain extent makes sense. You know, around consenting and all that. I did have a little bit of a concern. He talked a lot about training and trades training and attracting people into the trades, but he also talked about potentially, reading between the lines, undoing the reform of vocational education. So where it was, you know, part of it was broken, and so a solution was sort of vetted out, and that's sort of in play and getting some really good traction. And his sort of position was to undo all that and go back to the way it was. So I have a bit of a concern around that, quite a big one, yeah.
Helen, what do you think about National's vision for the construction sector specifically? There are a lot of examples there about other sectors. Goldsmith is obviously the finance spokesperson, so understandable that he's not across all the detail, but do you think National has enough of a focus on this sector?
I think Paul was probably up against a little bit of was hamstrung somewhat by the fact that they haven't yet announced any policy in this area. And so it's a little bit difficult to get a real handle on, to be frank, what the actual initiatives will be in this space. I guess the thing that I would be looking for in that policy detail is addressing the post-GFC issue that we did run into with construction and housing. We didn't build anything for 5 to 7 years. We lost 5 to 7 years worth of apprentices and chippies and sparkies, etc., who not only left to go to Australia but just didn't get trained, don't exist. We can't afford to do that again, and I guess that, I think, for the whole residential sector is something that is still outstanding for all of us in terms of what's the detail there.
Johnny, quick comment from you.
Yeah, well, without naming a policy, he almost gave it by saying he was going to rely on the private sector to stimulate the market, and so with that you need consumer confidence. So I think he's missed the mark a little bit in terms of that policy. There was no indication of anything to stimulate, and you're going to need it because we're going down a lower GDP track for a period.
Thank you very much to all of you for your comments and your insights and your questions this afternoon. It's been really great to have you here. Thank you also to Minister Grant Robertson and Nationals Paul Goldsmith for their time today and for answering our questions. We will be back here next week for our last session in this year's Constructive series. We'll be talking about business resilience next week. And if you want to rewatch this afternoon's session, you can do so on the Constructive website. It'll be available very, very shortly. Thanks very much for joining us and for your questions. Have a good evening.